The wind screamed through the skeletal trees, bearing on its breath a whisper, an ancient thing, an unseen thing. The night had fallen like a dark shroud over the barren valley, where the remains of an ancient village were hidden away under centuries of corruption. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something decaying. Akil shuddered and tightened his jacket around himself. "This place is cursed," he grumbled, looking at the ruined pieces of stone houses. Adil snickered at his side, though there wasn't much mirth in it. "Cursed or otherwise, we're going to have to find some shelter. The storm is only getting worse." The team had been trekking for hours in the wilderness, pushed off their initial course by a sudden landslide. Now they stood in the midst of an old village, engulfed in fog and years. Their flashlights only made a feeble incision in the blackness, casting nervous, wavering shadows on the devastated walls. "We shouldn't be here," Fatima whispered, her voice barely heard above the wind. Her gaze flicked around, her eyes sweeping over the vacant windows of the dilapidated houses. They felt like they were being observed. Hamid, always the cynic, laughed. "Come on, Fatima. It's an old village. There's nothing here but dust and abandoned stones." Mina Hill wrapped her arms around herself, her breath misting in the cold air. "Then why does it feel wrong?" No one knew. Rafiq moved forward into what seemed to be the biggest building in the village. The wooden door groaned as he pushed it open, showing a hollowed-out shell of what used to be a social gathering hall. The ceiling was dipping, the walls were lined with weird, ancient carvings, and the smell of charred wood and something metallic hung in the air. "What is this place?" Javaria whispered, entering the building with slow caution. Imad flashed his light over the carvings. "They're warning signs," he said, tracing the deep engravings with his fingers. The symbols writhed and looped in abnormal curves, illustrating bizarre creatures with stretched limbs and empty eyes. "This isn't normal." Aisha wrapped her arms around herself, working warmth into her limbs. "Can we please find a place to sit down? I don't want to be standing here any longer than necessary." The others nodded and they fanned out, laying down their backpacks. The hallway was as quiet as could be, only the wind was whistling through the seams. It would have been comforting to be inside, but none of them were able to brush away the growing unease that clung to their skin. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, the way the wind makes the trees whisper, but clearer after that, distinct voices speaking in a language none of them knew. Adil's breath caught. "Did you hear that?" "I thought it was the wind," Hamid replied, though his voice was uncertain. Minahil's face had turned white. Someone's talking. The group looked at each other nervously. Nobody wished to be the first to admit the reality, but the noise was unmistakable. Low, guttural whispers floating through the deserted hall. Then, a resounding thud came from the end of the room. Fatima gasped and grabbed Akil's arm. What was that? Rafiq slowly lifted his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness. Nothing. The room was still the same. Vacant, save for them. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was denser, filled with something intangible, something old. "Okay," Samina said, her voice trembling. "Perhaps this isn't the best place to stay after all." Another thud, this one nearer. Then, the whispering ceased. A cold silence descended upon them, heavy and choking. The wind outside had ceased, as if the whole world had come to a standstill, holding its breath. Akil's heart was racing in his chest. "We have to go." The others didn't dispute this. They took their bags and rushed for the door. But as Rafiq moved to grasp the handle, the atmosphere turned icy, so cold that frost instantly began forming on the wooden handle. His breath escaped in white wisps, and his fingers numbed from the temperature drop. And then, the door shut by itself. Aisha gave a shocked scream. Adil grabbed the handle, pulling, but it would not move. "It's stuck," he cried. "Help me." Rafiq came to assist him, tugging with every ounce of strength, but the door would not yield. The cold was still dropping. Their breathing became shallow, their fingers cold. Then, out of the darkness of the corridor, there came a noise. A gasping breath, a slow, labored exhale. Someone, or something, was in the room with them. The flashlight beams danced back and forth, moving swiftly in the hunt for what had made the sound. Shadows writhed and contorted in unnatural ways, as if whatever was making them move was within them. And then, they noticed it. Standing at the end of the hall, just out of range from their flashlights, was a figure, huge, immobile, clad in torn black robes. Its face was hidden in the dark, but its eyes, 2 points of white light, were fixed on them. Minahil whimpered, backing away. "That's not human." The figure inclined its head slightly, as though examining them. Then it took a step ahead. The whispers came back again, now a chorus of sounds ringing in their ears. Akil's eyes grew misty. The carvings on the wall began to crawl, twisting themselves into hideous forms. Unseen eyes' weight crushed over them, a suffocating presence. The figure stepped another step. Sudden wind raged through the hall, burning out their flashlights. It engulfed them in darkness. And then, a scream, piercing, loud, and everything went dark. Akil's scream echoed through the darkness, raw and harsh, before being muffled by the crushing silence. The instant their flashlights had gone out, the world had changed. An agony of pressure clamped on their chests, heavy and crushing like a shroud. Then, suddenly, the flashlights began to shine again. Akil gasped, chest straining as he struggled back. The figure vanished. But something was different. The room was off. The air was wet, heavy with the smell of rotting wood and decay, but underneath that, something more sinister hung in the air, a coppery taste, like rusted metal or dried blood. "Where is it?" Fatima's voice shook as she gripped Hamid's arm. Akil shook his head. He had seen it. They had all seen it. "It was standing right there," Minahil whispered, her beam of light quivering as she indicated the place where the figure had stood. But now there was nothing. Only the deserted corridor and the odd, changing carvings on the walls. "We have to leave," Rafiq stated, his voice steady but just covering his fear. Adil shook the door handle a second time, but it still wouldn't budge, locked as if welded together. Still stuck. His breath puffed out in white clouds. "Damn it, it's freezing in here." "We need an alternative exit," said Javaria. "Check the windows." The group fanned out, searching the room. The windows were merely holes in the walls of stone, but something was wrong about them. No light streamed through. There was only darkness. It was as if the village outside did not exist, having been swallowed up by a vast nothing. "This isn't right," Samina whispered. "We should be able to see the trees, the road, something." Aisha ran her hand over one of the window frames. The instant her fingers made contact with the stone, she jerked back with a gasp. "What?" Imad spun around to face her. "It's warm," she stuttered, "like something's breathing on the other side." A slow, deep breath slid through the room. The torches flickered once more. Something was observing. Akil gulped. His brain screamed at him to flee, but where? They were surrounded. Then they heard it. A delicate tapping, rhythmic, prolonged, from the distance end of the hall, where the figure had been standing. Tap, tap, tap. They all turned as one, each heartbeat thudding in tandem. The sound was not originating from within the room. It was coming from below them. "The floor!" Imad growled. They pointed their flashlights downwards. The wooden boards were old and twisted, but now, in the faint light of their beams, they could notice something else. Delicate, splintered cracks in a ring shape in the middle of the floor. "Is that a trapdoor?" Hamid whispered. The tapping became louder, more urgent. Something was on the other side. Rafik paused for a moment before moving forward. He knelt, tracing his fingers over the cracks. The wood was freezing to the touch, but as he leaned on it, there was a soft creak that filled the room. "Help me open it," he said. "Are you crazy?" Minahil's voice was high-pitched. "Why would we—" "Do you want to remain up here with whatever else is in this hallway?" Rafik snapped. "If there's a tunnel or another exit down there, we have to take it." The team shared nervous glances, but nobody had a better idea. Rafik and Adil worked together to pry the trapdoor edges open. The wood creaked in protest before eventually giving way with a loud crack, showing a dark, yawning hole below them. A damp, stale smell wafted up from the hole, mixed with the cold air. A staircase led down into the unknown. Fatima stepped back. "We don't even know where it goes." Aisha looked down, her flashlight fighting to cut through the darkness. "It's better than being here." Another heavy breath swept through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet, dozens of them. They were out of time. They went down one by one. The stairs were wet, the stone underfoot slippery with water. The air was thick, full of the smell of damp earth and something old. At the bottom, their flashlights picked out a narrow tunnel leading on, cut from rough stone. "Where the hell are we?" Imad breathed. "The village foundation, perhaps?" Rafik speculated. "Old storage tunnels?" "No," Hamid replied, his voice strained. "This is older, much older." Akil swept his flashlight across the walls. Weird symbols were carved into the rock like those upstairs, but more complex, more threatening. The figures carved onto the walls were not human. Their arms and legs were too long. Their eyes were empty holes. Their mouths, too wide, filled with sharp teeth. "These are not warnings," Javaria whispered. "They're stories." Minahil scowled. "Stories about what?" Hamid ran his finger over the carvings, tracing them with a trembling finger. "About them." Aisha shivered. "Them. The nameless ones," he breathed. As soon as he spoke the words, the tunnel shook. A low, throaty sound echoed from the darkness in front, a deep, unhuman groan. Samina clutched Minahil's hand. "We have to turn back." "We can't," said Rafik. "We don't even know if the door is open now." "Then we keep going," Adil said, attempting to sound more courageous than he actually felt. The tunnel continued on, growing narrower as they traveled. The farther in they went, the colder it grew. Breaths were rough gasps, fingers stiff against the flashlight handles. Walls seemed to close in, as if the tunnel itself was a living thing, inhaling with them. Then the carving shifted. The figures no longer simply stood. They were moving, twisting, reaching. Akil's stomach roiled as he recognized what he saw. The story was not merely about them. It was about them, their pack. The last carving depicted 11 figures lined up in a row, their faces contorted with fear as black shapes hovered in the background. And at its bottom, one last symbol. A door, a locked door. A sigh crawled along the tunnel. Not wind, not air, a voice. "Turn back." Aisha strained a sob. "We have to leave here, now." As if in reply, the tunnel convulsed once more. Something began to crawl from the darkness ahead, not walking, not running, crawling. Long skeletal fingers dug into the stone, dragging a twisted, gaunt body into the dimness. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, bones creaking beneath waxy, stretched skin. Its face, no, its absence of a face, was the worst. Just a smooth, featureless void. It reached out to them, and then the whispers became screams. The tunnel shook as the monstrosity hauled itself along. The bony fingers clawing against the wet stone. The lack of a face should have made it less frightening, but for some reason, it was worse. A void where its face should have been, as if someone had taken its face away. Aisha was the first to react, pulling Minahil back. "Run!" The group spun about and ran down the narrow tunnel, their shoes thudding on the floor of stone. The air hung heavy with wetness, forcing them to pant, but panic drove them forward. Behind, the creature expelled a harsh, wheezing sound, half breath, half growl. Akil dared a glance over his shoulder. It moved quicker than it appeared, its limbs jerked and unnatural motion, bones crunching with every step, but it was catching up. "Quickly!" Hamid bellowed. Their flashlights whirled about, long, erratic shadows cast against the walls. The carvings twisted in the light, hollow-eyed faces stretching, reaching, as if seeking freedom from the stone that contained them. A fork in the tunnel lay before them. "Which?" Rafiq panted. "Left!" Adil bellowed unhesitantly. No one protested. They turned left, holding on by mere inches as the tunnel slanted downward. The creature howled, a shriek of an unnatural quality that ran down their spines. The walls shook, then the ground beneath them changed. The floor collapsed. Akil slid, a brief feeling of falling before his spine hit the chilled ground. Severe pain struck up his neck, expelling the air from his body. The others moved around him, groaning with dazed senses but alive nonetheless. Dust and rubble dropped from the opening above as the tunnel caved in behind, trapping them in. There was silence for one moment. A single sound later. A careful, measured tap. From behind the rubble. The beast was still present, but it couldn't get to them. Not yet. Akil coughed, shooing away the dust. His flashlight had made it through the fall, its faint beam lighting up the cavernous space around them. The air was moist, heavy with the smell of dirt and something rotten. "Is everybody all right?" he croaked. Painful groans replied. Minahil rubbed her arm and sat up. Barely. Adil grimaced as he examined his leg. "I think I twisted my ankle." "Great," Fatima grumbled. "Now what?" Samina played her flashlight back and forth. "Where are we?" The cavern lay out before them, its walls of odd, spiky rocks that seemed almost man-made. The ceiling was a long way above, lost in darkness. Javaria nodded toward the opposite end. "There's something there." They took their time moving. The earth was uneven, wet, and made them move gingerly. Getting closer, their flashlights lit up something ominous. Bones. Scattered on the floor, half hidden in the ground, half heaped against the walls. Skulls with empty sockets gazed back at them, their faces frozen in screamless expressions. "Oh my God," Aisha breathed. Hamid kneeled down beside one heap. "These are not animal bones." "They're human," Imad whispered. A foul understanding settled in on them. This wasn't merely a cave, it was a graveyard. Fatima stepped back. "We have to leave here. Now." Adil ground his teeth together as he got to his feet. "We don't even know where here is." Akil directed his flashlight at the walls of the cavern. Weird symbols were etched into the rock, the same as those above. He ran a finger over them, sensing the bumpy grooves under his finger. "These marks," he whispered. Hamid moved in next to him. "They're warnings." Minahil furrowed his brow. "Warnings of what?" Before they could respond, a heavy thud resonated through the cavern. A tremor passed through the earth, causing the bones to clatter. Something shifted in the darkness. Their flashlights flickered. A shuffling sound, slow, deliberate. Not just one. Many. Akil's throat went dry. "We're not alone." A long, wheezing breath filled the cavern, followed by the unmistakable sound of bare feet dragging against stone. More creatures. They were everywhere. Shadows twisted at the edges of their light. Fingers scraped against the rock. Empty faces turned toward them. Featureless yet aware. The nameless ones had found them. Aisha stifled a sob. No. The first one entered the light, its frame impossibly gaunt, its skin drawn tightly over spiny bones. Another emerged at its side, and another. They came together in perfect motion, their heads at awkward angles. Then they attacked. "Run!" Rafik cried. They wheeled and ran deeper into the cavern, avoiding crumbling bones as the monsters scuttled behind them, their spindly fingers clawing at the air. The tunnel turned and curved, the air turning colder with every pace. A soft blue light flared in the distance. "The light!" Hamid yelled. "Run towards it!" The creatures screamed, their voices resonating in the tunnel like a symphony of tortured spirits. The passage narrowed, compelling them to compress themselves through a jagged opening. They went through one by one. Akil was last. As he strained forward, something caught his ankle. A cold, clawed hand. He winced, kicking frantically. His foot struck something brittle, and the hold relaxed. He stumbled ahead, falling into the open chamber ahead. The creatures didn't pursue. They lingered at the entrance, their bodies convulsing as if held back by some unperceived force. Then they withdrew, vanishing into the shadows. Akil gasped, his hands trembling. What just happened? The others were already gazing forward, their eyes wide with shock. He turned and stood still. The room was enormous, its ceiling reaching high into blackness. In the middle was an old stone building, an altar adorned with worn symbols, and above it, etched into the stone, was a door. Not any door. The door from the carvings, the one they were not to open. Silence in the room. Then a whisper. "You are not meant to be here." The candlelight above the altar trembled. The door started to shake, and something knocked from the other side. The knocking went on. Slow, intentional. Every thump on the old stone door made a shudder course through the cave, resonating the ground under them. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Aisha held Minahil's hand, her fingers pressing deep into her friend's skin. Akil's flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls as he moved closer, his eyes refusing to leave the huge rune-covered door. It stood before them, set into the cavern wall like it had been there forever, waiting. The markings etched into its face were older than anything they'd ever seen, twisting, looping patterns that seemed to change under the poor light. Adil swallowed hard. We have to get out of here." Imad shook his head. "Did you see what occurred behind us? Those creatures. They stopped at the door. They won't enter this place." "Perhaps that makes us safer here," Hamid suggested, though his tone gave away his own doubt. "Or perhaps it means something worse is on the other side of that door," Fatima whispered. Another knock. This time, the knock was more than a sound. It was a voice, a whisper, low and rasping like the final gasp of a dying man. "Let me out." Minahil shivered. "Did you hear that?" Everyone had. Akil moved forward, his beam of light trembling. The nearer he came, the colder the air grew. It wasn't the damp cold of the underground. It was something unnatural, something evil. His breath fogged in front of him. "Stop," Rafik said. Akil hardly made a sound. He was attracted to the symbols, to the raw power of the presence behind the door. He extended his hand, his fingers trembling just above the coarse surface. Something stirred under his skin. Not his own flesh, but something within him. A crawling, deep sensation, as if unseen threads had wrapped themselves into his bones. He pulled his hand back. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You are close now." Akil stepped backward, his heart racing. "We need to go, now." The others didn't debate. They were about to leave, but the ground gave a twist. A rumbling boom sounded from the walls, followed by a blast of cold wind. The cavern shook as the altar in the center of the room started to glow. The ancient runes ignited, one by one. The door was awaking. The light throbbed, its shadows like claws on the walls. Javaria grasped Aisha's wrist. "It's happening again." The banging resolved into crashing, desperate, insistent. Dust sprinkled down from the ceiling, and with each blow, the stone door began to split, tiny fractures etching like cracks in the stones. Imad swore. "It's cracking. We need to make it stop," Minahil bellowed. "How?" demanded Adil. The symbols. Akil's glance swiveled back to the carvings. They were more than threats. They were blueprints. "Help!" he shouted, hastening to the altar. The others faltered but came along, their fear momentarily lost in the panic in his tone. "What do we do?" Hamid queried. Akil stroked his fingers across the glowing symbols. "These are binding runes. They're used to seal something inside." "Then let's strengthen them," Fatima exclaimed. Aisha's voice trembled. "But what if they're not supposed to keep us safe?" They all stood still. The thudding on the door increased in ferocity, rattling the cavern's very foundations. The whispers became harsh gasps, as if something famished, wanting to get out. "Please." Javaria plugged her ears. "Stop it!" A blood-curdling shriek came from behind them. The creatures, they hadn't departed. They had waited. Their white, faceless faces materialized at the entrance of the cavern, their bony bodies twisting as if in pain. And then they did something they had never done before. They bowed, not to the group, to the door. A realization hit Akil like a hammer. "They're not our enemies," he breathed. "They're the gatekeepers." The nameless ones were present to make sure the door never opened. And now, they were begging for assistance. A choice had to be made. The altar's light grew brighter. The cracks in the door grew larger. The creatures emitted mournful, echoing wails. There was no time left. Akil held his hands above the altar. He had no idea what he was doing, but something within him took over. The runes awakened to his touch, shining brighter, pulsing in rhythm with his heart. Minahil did the same, her hands above the carvings. Then Hamid. Then Fatima. Each of them laid their will upon the ancient magic one by one. The door shook with violence. The power behind it shrieked, not with anger, but with fear. It was frightened of being locked away once more. "No!" The cavern howled with power as the runes burst into radiance. The door boomed once, a deafening sound, and then silence. The light died. The door stood motionless. The nameless ones retreated, their bodies shaking, their heads bowed in silent thanks. The threat had passed, for now. Akil collapsed to his knees, panting. The others were equally shaken, their bodies depleted. Hamid weakly laughed. "Did we just save the world or postpone the inevitable?" Minahil whispered. Fatima breathed sharply. "I don't want to know." The cavern was quiet, the door once more inactive. But they knew better than to think the horror was finished. Javaria gazed at the monsters. What now? One of the nameless ones moved forward. For the first time, it lifted a hand. A slow, deliberate movement, a warning. They were not supposed to be here, and they had awakened something that would never cease trying to break free. Akil nodded, comprehending the unspoken message. "We leave." They moved towards the tunnel back to the surface. The nameless ones observed them departing, their empty faces inscrutable. As they approached the tunnel mouth, one final whisper chased them. "It will return." The door. The thing on the other side. This was not the end. It was just the start. The team crept quietly. The atmosphere seemed thicker now, as if the cavern itself hated them. Each step seemed to boom off the empty tunnels, bouncing against ancient rock, a harsh reminder of the creature they had managed to barely confine. Akil went first, his flashlight faltering. The others trailed after him, their faces pinched with fear and fatigue. They had been able to hold off the thing on the other side of the door for the time being, but the tension in their bones warned them the battle was far from over. Minahil held onto Fatima's hand, her knuckles locked white. "Do you think it's really sealed?" "No," Adil grunted. Hamid gave him a glare. "Can you not do this right now?" "I'm just saying what we're all thinking." Adil's voice was strained. "That thing, whatever it wasn't afraid of us. It was afraid of returning. We didn't defeat it. We merely delayed whatever it was attempting to do." Javaria wrapped her arms around herself. "Then let's not stand around waiting for it to attempt again." The cave was infinite, curving in impossible directions. They had descended deep into the earth, but as they continued, the tunnel didn't seem to be taking them upwards. Rafik caught it first. "Wait," he said, halting abruptly. The others almost ran into him. "What is it?" Aisha breathed. "Shouldn't we have been at the entrance by now?" Akil checked his watch. Nearly an hour had passed since they had left the sealed door. They had walked in a straight line, yet the tunnel stretched endlessly before them, dark and unyielding. "It's like..." Minahil swallowed. "Like it's changing." Imad turned in a slow circle, his flashlight casting eerie, shifting shadows. "No," he murmured, "not changing. It's keeping us here." A cold shiver ran through them. Fatima inhaled sharply. "We're trapped." They moved on, their breathing short and ragged. The air was damp, old, like the cavern was untouched by the passage of time. But something was awakening, something observing. Akil clenched his teeth. "We have to move." He didn't mention the whispers. Soft, barely audible, weaving across the air like smoke. They weren't words, but senses. Silhouettes of things buried a long time. He could sense them scraping against the boundaries of his mind, searching for an opening. Something was attempting to force itself through. The light at the front dimmed. A figure loomed at the boundary of the shadows. Everyone stood still. He was a man, or what was left of one. His skin taut over bones, his eyes empty sockets of infinite darkness. He had the tattered husks of robes wrapped around his skeletal form, the cloth breaking apart into powder as he shifted a step. "You should not have come," the creature rasped. Minahil breathed a strangling gasp. "Who? What are you?" The abomination cocked its head. A warning. The cavern shook. "Go away," it went on, its voice echoing through the rock. "Or be forgotten like the rest." Akil moved closer. "What do you mean, forgotten?" The figure danced like a guttering candle. "This place does not release. It takes. It erases, until nothing is left but whispers in the darkness." Fatima's breath caught. "Then, how do we escape?" The figure raised a bony hand, gesturing behind them. A second tunnel had manifested, one that wasn't there before. No one wished to believe the ghostly apparition, yet they had no recourse. They walked into the new corridor, going quicker now, their heels frantic. The walls seemed closer in this place, pushing in, choking. Then the voices began. Not whispers, but loud, screaming voices. Some shouted for help, others pleaded. Some laughed, a dry, cracked tone that chilled their backs. Javaria covered her ears. "Make it stop!" The tunnel shook with savage spasms, the walls curling like writhing snakes. Akil fled. So did they all. The tunnel went on forever, curving longer whatever their speed. The air congealed around them, filled with unseen bulk, crushing against their chests, choking them. Then, light. A shimmer of light at the far end of the tunnel. Hope erupted through them. "Go!" Adil screamed. They crawled forward one by one, scrabbling at the door. Air outside was chill, actual fresh air. It was wet and smelled of stone and moss. Minahil pushed through first. She fell onto the ground outside, panting. Fatima next. Then Aisha. They all moved forward one by one. Akil was last. He stepped forward and he heard it. A whisper, almost in his ear. "You took something with you." Then, the world shifted, and he was outside. The group stood in stunned silence. They had made it out. The entrance to the cavern had disappeared behind them, replaced by an unbroken rock wall. It was as if it had never been there at all. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The forest was silent, unnatural in its stillness. Akil turned to the others. "We're not safe," Hamid snorted. "What? We escaped. We're finished." "No," Akil breathed, shaking his head. "We're not." Something had shifted. He could feel it, nudging the perimeters of his mind. The same energy from within the cavern. They had gotten out of the tomb, but the tomb had tracked them down. Rafiq's eyes moved frantically. "Then what do we do?" Akil regarded each of them, his fists screwed up. "We discover what it desires," he stated, "before it's too late." The chill wind whistled, bearing on the gusts a well-known, rasping whisper. It is never too late. The woods had never been so still before. Akil stood at the clearing's edge, gazing at the unbroken rock wall where the cave entrance used to be. The others stayed behind him, their breathing shallow, their muscles taut. No one said anything. No one was brave enough to. Something had trailed behind them. He felt it. A heaviness pushing on his chest, intangible but crushing. It wasn't fear, it was presence. Whatever was inside the cavern wasn't contained anymore. It had managed to escape, and now it was with them. Rafiq was the first to break the silence. "We have to go." Hamid shook his head. "Where to?" "Anywhere but here," Javaria whispered, hugging herself tight. Adil let out a sharp breath. "He's right. We have to move." Akil nodded, finally looking away from the rock face. "We stay together. No one gets lost. And if anyone sees or hears anything—" "I already do," Minahil interrupted. They all stood still. She was white, her hands trembling. "It's whispering again. I can hear it." The wind whipped through the trees, but beneath it, there was something else. A rasping, scuttling sound, like fingers scraping over rock. It was coming from behind them. Fatima whirled, her voice little more than a breath. "We must run." No one protested. They ran. The road was not familiar. They had passed through the woods previously, but now it seemed twisted, altered. The trees seemed to close in on them, the bare limbs reaching out like grasping fingers. The wind brought voices. "You did not leave alone." Aisha faltered. Hamid steadied her before she went down, pulling her up onto her feet. "Come along!" The group surged forward. Branches cracked behind them. Footsteps, quiet, purposeful. Something was behind them. Javaria shifted her gaze, and her shriek came so close to breaking the stillness. There. A figure strode among the trees, high, empty, watching. No one lingered to glance. They fled until their lungs were seared, until their legs went wobbly. Until at last, the trees snapped. They erupted out onto the main road. The village stretched before them, its lights far away like dying stars. For the first time since they had fled the cavern, hope seeped in. "We made it," Imad breathed. But Akil wasn't so confident. Something still didn't feel right. The village was eerily quiet when they arrived. Houses towered in the shadows, their windows dark, their doors closed. No nightbirds sang. No faraway hum of voices, only silence. Fatima caught Minahil's arm. "Where is everybody?" Rafiq looked out over the deserted streets. "It's late. Perhaps they're all in bed." "No," Akil grumbled. "Something's not right." They crept forward slowly, each step ringing too loudly in the unnatural silence. Then, a door creaked open. An old man was in the doorway of a house, his eyes deep set, his face ashen. "You shouldn't have returned." The words made ice run down Akil's spine. What are you talking about? The man paused. Then, slowly, he gestured towards them. Look at your shadows. The group turned together, and horror took hold of them. Their shadows reached out abnormally long, contorting at strange angles. But that was not the worst. Each of them had a second shadow, a darker one, a moving one, not their own. Mina Hill emitted a strangled sob. It's still with us. The old man shook his head. No, he whispered. It is you. Panic took hold. Aisha stepped back, her hands shaking. This can't happen. Imad's voice was a whisper. We need assistance. But the old man was already withdrawing into his home. No one can assist you. The door slammed shut. Silence came back. No one stirred. No one said a word for a long, long time. Then Rafik breathed a quivering breath. What are we to do? Akil willed himself to think. We have to get in, someplace safe. Safe? Adil sneered. You think that any place is safe now? But nobody knew a better option. They relocated swiftly, and the old deserted house on the outskirts of the village was found. The interior was dusty with the smell of old age and rot. Windows were shrouded in heavy drapes. For a little while it felt almost ordinary. Then the whispers returned. You are not who you were. Javaria clasped her hands over her ears. Make it stop. Akil clamped his hands on her shoulders. Stay with me. Stay alert. But his own mind was unraveling. The pressure in his chest had increased. The air seemed denser. Then a shadow stirred, not theirs. Something else was with them inside. A form unstuck itself from the wall, tall and blank, its head cocked as if examining them. Then it spoke. Let go. They couldn't breathe. The shadow crept closer, its presence smothering. The house seemed smaller, the walls closing in. Aisha whimpered. What does it want? The shadow cocked its head once more. To return. Fatima clutched Akil's arm. What do we do? He didn't know. But he sensed something. A pull. A connection. A horrific realization struck him. It wasn't just following them. It was them. The cavern had claimed something. Shards of them. And as compensation, it had returned something else. Something that didn't belong. And now it wished to make the exchange whole. Akil moved closer, his words trembling. What if we let go? The shadow remained silent. It simply extended toward him. And as its hands extended toward him, he noticed something. A glimpse. Of himself. Trapped. Still within the cavern, still screaming. His breath caught. Oh my God. They hadn't escaped. They had only believed they had. The cavern had never released them. And now, it was summoning them back. The shadow whispered again. Come home. Akil's breath came in short gasps. The shadow in front of him lengthened impossibly tall, its fingers curling like wisps of smoke, reaching out for him. Come home, it whispered again. The others were petrified, their faces white, their eyes glowing with a horror they couldn't even begin to understand. The truth of their reality had finally hit them. Their way out had never been real. They still had part of themselves left behind in the cavern, trapped, crying. And whatever it was that had come with them, whatever had replaced them, it wasn't them anymore. Adil was the first to shift, stepping backward so suddenly he almost stumbled on a shattered chair. This isn't real, he murmured, shuddering. This can't be real. Rafik bunched his fists into his palms. But it is. Hamid breathed a shuddery breath, and his voice cracked. So what do we do? Nothing, because they didn't know. Outside, the wind was howling, shaking the old wooden frame of the house. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing, unnatural in their motion. The air was heavy, thick, like the atmosphere itself was bearing down on them. They didn't belong here anymore, or worse, they did, and something else belonged in the cavern. We have to go back, Akil finally spoke. Mina Hill turned her head sharply to him. Are you crazy? Consider this, he went on, speaking softly. We've had this feeling ever since we left. This burden, this incorrectness. It's because we are not complete. We left part of ourselves behind. Javaria's fingers were shaking. But if we return, they may not allow us to leave at all, Aisha concluded, her voice empty. Akil spoke to the rest of them. His eyes locked on theirs. Perhaps we weren't ever meant to have left at all. The words lingered, heavy and unspoken. Adil swallowed hard. If we go back, what becomes of this? He waved at the shadows on the walls, the ones which moved of themselves. No one could answer. But there was only one way to be sure. They went in haste, their footsteps almost soundless along the dirt road. The village was hauntingly deserted, windows blacked out, the homes standing as motionless guards. No one in sight. The place seemed to have already made peace with the fact that they were no more. The woods stood in front, the limbs reaching out for the sky. Re-entering them seemed to be crossing the jaws of some old, gnawing monster. The farther they walked, the thicker the air became. Every step was like wading through something viscous, unseen, alive. And then, the whispering began once more, not far this time, right next to them. Almost home. Javaria shivered. We shouldn't be doing this. But we must, Akil whispered. The trees parted before them, and the clearing came into view. The rock wall loomed before them, untouched, unbroken, as if the entrance had never been there. But they knew better now. It had always been there, waiting. Minahil extended a shaking hand and laid it against the stone. Nothing occurred for a long time. Then, the wall trembled. A low, booming crack reverberated through the clearing. The stone rippled as water. And then, once more, the entrance to the cavern swung open. Darkness stretched out before them, inviting. The way down was slower this time. Not because they were afraid, but because the cavern seemed deeper now, going on forever under the ground. The air was heavy with an unnatural dampness, the smell of rot and ancient stone. Their flashlights cut dimly through the darkness. Do you sense that? Hamid breathed. Akil nodded. Yeah. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. They had been here before, or at least, some part of them never left. A noise came from up ahead, a low, guttural moan. The flashlights danced. Then, the cavern opened up, and they saw them, themselves. The figures stood in the darkness, identical in every respect. Same clothes, same faces, same wide, frightened eyes. But they were wrong. Their faces were contorted, not just with fear, but with something else, something unnatural, and they were smiling. Javaria gagged on a scream. What are they? The figures moved forward as one, their movements unnervingly synchronized. You, one of them whispered. Rafiq shook his head fiercely. Number no. The other Rafiq nodded. Yes. Akil's voice remained firm, but his hands shook. We left you behind. His duplicate took another step closer. You are us. Minahil grasped Fatima's arm. This isn't happening. The figures smiled wider. It already has. Akil felt it again, the pull, stronger now, like a weight pulling him down, home, calling him. You are empty, his reflection whispered. We are whole. And then, without warning, they rushed forward. The impact was immediate. Akil felt himself being torn in two, his mind splintering, memories writhing, snatches of the past, the present, the other. The cavern distorted around them. Voices screamed, bodies blurred together. He felt himself falling, drowning in darkness. And then, silence. Akil opened his eyes. He was outside the cavern, the village ahead, the forest behind him. The others were there too. But something was off. Something was amiss. Or perhaps, something was back where it belonged. Nobody talked. Nobody could. because deep down in their chests, each one of them understood they'd never really gone, and whatever it was that walked out of the cavern this time wasn't them anymore. The wind whispered for a final time, "Welcome home." Did you sense the shadows closing in? If you liked Cold Shadows, do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Phantom Fables for more spine-tingling tales. Your nightmares have only just started.